The talk of the town, so to speak, over the last week has been all about NVIDIA stock. And this time, maybe in a bit more of a negative light. Good afternoon. We've got consumer confidence and a bit of a more specific story, but we're going to talk about how this relates to the broader markets here today. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, the data, the trends that we're watching, and hopefully weed out a little bit of the noise here along the way. So before we get into the main story, I guess, of the week, I want to highlight a couple of quick things. First, of course, is that we did have GDP revision come out today on Thursday. But I also want to back up to Tuesday where we had consumer confidence numbers come out. The reason I wanted to highlight this is kind of as a follow-up to last week's question of the week about how the consumer affects the economy. This consumer confidence number wasn't much of a surprise or a huge shift, but I did just want to highlight it given the focus there last week. The gist of it is that consumer confidence did come out slightly down from the prior month, but again, not much of a surprise. I think it generally was roughly in line with expectations, but just slightly down from the month prior. But what I really want to focus on this week, and it will be a bit of a shorter week here. I'm actually out of town, as you probably can tell. So we'll keep it a bit shorter here this week. But what I wanted to focus is that the talk of the town, so to speak, over the last week has been all about NVIDIA stock. And this time, maybe in a bit more of a negative light, whereas obviously over the past couple of years or so, it's been all positive. And the reason for this is we've seen NVIDIA stock drop significantly and drop quickly over the past, let's say a couple of weeks or so. But although there's obviously a story here in the stock in and of itself, what I actually wanted to do is try and broaden that up a little bit and talk about how this relates to the broader stock market. So let's call it the NASDAQ or the S&P, depending on which index you want to focus on here. So the reason I wanted to highlight that is because although obviously there is a story in and of itself with NVIDIA stock, and depending on if you own it or how you've got your portfolio structured, you likely are paying close attention. But even if you don't own it directly, many of you may also own it indirectly, and probably a pretty sizable chunk as well, because especially for those who might own an S&P 500 mutual fund or index fund or ETF or whatever, what that does is it's meant to track the S&P 500. And the way that the S&P 500 works is it's actually weighted based on the size of the company. And so what we end up seeing, and we saw this back in 2021 as well, I guess, continued, but certainly back in 2021 is maybe a more relevant factor for what I'm about to share, is that when these companies get very large, like NVIDIA, Apple, Microsoft, right, these very large tech companies, what ends up happening is they actually take up a pretty significant chunk of the total index. And so when you own, for instance, an S&P 500 index fund, you may own a pretty sizable chunk of these companies already. And obviously that works great when things are going up, but it does have some impacts when things are going down. And we've certainly seen that over the last week or so. Not to say that markets, have significantly shifted, but it's certainly, this NVIDIA story has certainly impacted the broader stock market indexes over the past week or so here for sure. And what we've seen, the reason I want to highlight this is because although we've seen NVIDIA drop significantly, and generally when that happens, you would expect that the S&P as a whole might be down quite a bit. NVIDIA, I think, is, almost, not quite, but getting close to about 10% of the S&P index. And so when you see a pullback, you could expect that the S&P would pull back quite a bit as well. However, what's been happening is that the other, 490 plus companies out there have actually been holding up their end of the bargain here a little bit. Now, not all of them, to be clear, but what we've seen is this scenario where over the last week or so, again, the large name NVIDIA, let's say, has been pulling back, but a lot of the other smaller names have really been holding that index up, and in fact, seen a much broader kind of rally, so to speak, over the past week or so, which is great to see, by the way. That means that maybe things are healthy. It means that, likely there's some strength in other sectors of the economy. And obviously, the more broad these rallies are, the more, I don't want to say legitimate, but the more maybe sufficient that they might be, right? So very important story here. And again, obviously the NVIDIA stock in and of itself is important, but I did want to talk about how it relates to the broader markets because we've seen a big shift here over the last week or so. Thank you so much for tuning in here this week. Hopefully that was helpful to kind of look at a broader view on this obviously very large story with NVIDIA stock. But definitely a lot going on in the markets here coming up next week. So next week we have inflation, income and spending, and jobs week, all to kind of kick off the third quarter and obviously the start to July there. Plus the 4th of July, obviously we've got a holiday next Thursday. So enjoy the holiday, and we will be sure to keep you up to date as we get some data here coming into the coming week or two. Enjoy the holidays in the meantime, and hopefully we'll have some summer here in the Pacific Northwest shortly.